Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship NJ Museum and Memorial. And today we're going to talk about the use of wood on the battleship. I get a lot of questions about this, or hear a lot of incorrect statements or partially wrong statements about the battleships not being built with flammable materials and there's no wood on board and stuff like that. And so in today's video, we're going to talk about some of the uses of wood on the ship and some of the places where wood was substituted to be less flammable. We're sitting here in the officer's wardroom, which is one of the spaces that has wooden-looking furniture in it. But just like in the captain's cabin and other places around the ship, all of this furniture is made out of sheet metal. But it's been meticulously hand-painted to have a wood grain on it. My favorite piece of furniture is the cabinet that holds the ship's silver, because it not only has the wood grain painted on it, but it has the joints where multiple pieces of wood come together, and it even has little black fastener holes painted on it to make it look as much as possible like real wood furniture. Obviously, we all know that wood is very flammable, and yet it was used on ships for thousands of years. I mean, ships were even made out of wood entirely for that length of time. And even as the transition from wood to steel starts to be made, you still see significant amounts of wood being used inside of ships. For example, USS Monitor, even though she's the first American ironclad vessel in the US Navy, her interior compartments are largely made out of wood. Her subdivision is largely made out of wood. Her underwater hull is largely made out of wood. So there's all sorts of ornate wooden furniture and partitions between officers' staterooms and things like that. So she continues to use a lot of wood. Advance another 30 years and you get to the cruiser Olympia, and likewise, a lot of her furnishings on the inside of the ship is still made out of wood. You're starting to see more of a transition to metals, but especially in officers' quarters like the captain's cabin and the admiral's cabin, you still see a tremendous amount of wood. And this carries on even into World War II. And it seems like for the US Navy, 1942 is the point when they start to really reduce the amount of flammable objects on ships. Fire obviously is a huge hazard on a warship. You're not only carrying hazardous materials like fuels and paddlers that are extremely explosive or flammable, but also, unlike your home, if it catches on fire, you can't just run outside and escape the flames. You're stuck on the burning object with nowhere else to go. So it seems like the attack on Pearl Harbor was one of those moments that galvanized the US Navy into starting to remove flammable objects from a lot of their ships. And it wasn't just the attack on Pearl Harbor, but subsequent battles revealed that burning was a really serious problem, even on their modern steel-hulled vessels. And so as the Navy is starting to improve their damage control techniques, they're starting to get rid of as many of the things that are flammable as possible or reduce the threat. So one of the ways in which that is performed on ships like New Jersey that would traditionally have ornate wooden furnishings, they start to paint on the new wood pattern. And furnishings we find that have it painted on is usually a dead giveaway that that's an original feature to the ship. Post-World War II, particularly in the 60s and the 80s, you get things like this door over here, where rather than having it painted on, it's like a vinyl adhesive that goes on. And the tops of these counters are like that as well. So that all goes back to you never let progress stand in the way of tradition. Even though the Navy is evolving out of using flammable materials on the ship quite as much, they still need to keep the idea of that material there because that's what they've always done. Of course, the captain and the officers are going to get ornate wooden furniture. Well, just because the Navy remediates a lot of the wood on the ship doesn't mean that it's not still used. There are tons of places that wood is still used on the ship. In fact, we have a carpentry shop on board from day one through the end of the ship's career. In fact, during World War II, the rating of damage controlman didn't exist, and it was the carpenter's mates who did that. So one of the main types of wood that was on the ship is the shoring timbers. And these are used in damage control a lot. So for things like, let's say we've got a watertight door here that's part of a watertight bulkhead, but everything forward of this bulkhead is flooded. Actually, here in the wardroom, this would be aft of this bulkhead. And that water pressure is starting to push against this door, and look, the door opens inwards. So that is the weak part in this new watertight bulkhead. And so you could brace it with shoring timbers. And that is your damage control. You are not repairing it, you're just making a temporary patch until you can get out of combat to a point where you might be able to make a more permanent repair. And so wood is much more effective at this because you can pretty quickly cut it down. It's a really cheap material, so you can cut it to the shape you need. The Navy does start to use mechanical shores later on, but even though we carried mechanical shores throughout our career, Battleship New Jersey always carried shoring timber on board in numbers of places around the ship. They are all over the place. And it's one of the common questions we get as people are coming through. What is this rack of wood? Why are there all these 4x4s lying around the ship? The other main place that is wood, of course, is our teak wood deck. And they use wood there for a couple of reasons. One, teak is not very flammable, so they're specifically choosing that type of wood because it is not flammable. But not all American warships use teak wood decks. Aircraft carriers in the US Navy during World War II tended to have fir decks. It's a much softer wood, it's cheaper, so it's easier to repair. And if you take a bomb hit that puts a hole in the deck, you can really easily cut some new pieces of fir and put it out there. Likewise, older battleships would have used pine instead of teak. Even battleships like Texas that are serving in World War II right next to New Jersey with her teak wood decks. Remember, at this time, teak is not grown in the United States, so it is a lavish expense. And the only reason the US Navy uses teak instead of another type of wood is because of the Washington Naval Treaties. They limit the weight of the ship. And because of the strength of teak, you can use 2 inches of that instead of the 4 inches of pine like Texas has, and so you're saving weight that way. But why have a wood deck at all? One, the teak is less slippery than wet. Because of the grain of the wood, it has a natural profile. It's not smooth. And 2, it is much better insulation than steel. Think about what they were using as insulation during World War II. In engineering spaces, they had asbestos, sure, but most of the rest of the ship was insulated with cork, which is much more flammable than teak or even pine. Especially because it was in smaller, thinner chunks. It was easier for that to catch on fire than a big 4-inch block of wood. So, the Navy needed that insulation material. It made more sense being on the outside of the ship where it's blocking the sun from even hitting the steel and radiating inwards than it did on the inside of the ship. So they tended to insulate bulkheads with cork and the overheads with a wood deck. Now, obviously, as fiberglass insulation comes into use, that tends to be used on interior overheads, and you see teak decks disappear, so that even by the Vietnam War, only the old World War II holdovers still have teak decks. And not all of them, for that matter. Stop painting wood decks on your destroyer models. It drives me crazy. Go visit Kidd or Slate or any of these other destroyers. They have steel decks, exclusively steel decks. I'm sure there are some destroyers out there that had wood decks, but by and large, they don't. Stop painting them like that. There are lots of other uses of wood around the ship. For example, places where they don't want to, or the crew there don't have the skill set to weld a piece of plate metal. There's lots of places where there's wood installed. So for example, in the engine rooms, when they installed the halon suppressive gas alarms on the throttle boards, it was just, looks like a piece of pine to me that they bolted onto the existing board as opposed to welding a piece of metal. I don't know if there was another reason for using the wood other than it was just easier to work with. But things like that is an authorized ship alteration. It's not an unauthorized ship alt, like somebody deciding, hey, I want a wooden workbench here. Things like the butcher's block in the galley, like all of these are made out of wood, date back to when the ship was built. So even as the Navy is trying to remove flammable materials, they are accepting wooden objects because it is the best sort of material for the job at that time. Our volunteers still use the ship's original carpentry shop and the original teak wood deck that we're removing from the ship to make products. There's a link in the description below to the ship's store where you can see some of the products that we make on board. Check them out. Your purchase of those materials helps support the ongoing restoration of the ship. In addition to support like that, we also receive support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves who really appreciate that support, and it helps us restore the ship. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about us and the museum. Thanks for watching.